Hi, right. Welcome everyone to this meeting that's hosted by Nottingham RCG, Nottingham Revolutionary Communist Group. We've got three really interesting and really important talks this evening, so I don't want to take up too much time. But before we start, I just wanted to remind everyone that this is going to be a good opportunity to learn about things in more depth, to know what we're up against. I'm sure everyone knows, but there's going to be a lot of useful information in there that can really help us. And then I also just wanted to let you know that we are a revolutionary organisation and we rely on support for things like our newspaper that we produce, that we try and give a voice to a struggle happening around the world. I think someone is just going to post a link to it in the chat so you can see it, you can get a copy of it, you can read it online. Also, we need people to join us on the streets. We're organising in Nottingham and in other places all around the country against racism, against austerity, and for socialism. So we've got three talks. First, we're going to hear from Charles, then we're going to hear from Tom, and then we'll hear from Candice. There's going to be 10 minutes after each speech so that we can have some discussion. I thought it might be good if people write in the chat either just the topic that they want to ask about, or if you prefer to just ask your question in the chat and then I can read it out, we can do it that way. It's just that this way I can kind of group questions together and hopefully we'll get through everyone's questions or contributions, things that they want to say. And then right at the end as well, we'll have time for some like announcements. So anyone who's part of any campaigns that they want to share, or anyone who's got events coming up they want to invite people to, then please do that at the last bit. Cool. Okay, so yeah, welcome everyone. I'm gonna pass on now to the first speaker. The first speaker is Charles, who's a scientific writer for Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, and a grassroots organiser. So please, yeah, welcome Charles, and take it away.
Hello, thank you very much, Ruby. Let me just share my screen. Hang on. Share screen. Can you see that? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So I'm gonna, some of these slides I'll just whiz through. We can come back to afterwards for questions. So we're going to be talking about industrial agriculture and zoonotic viruses. First, we'll be talking about the current pandemic and its costs. Then we'll be talking about something called spillover. And then we'll be going into industrial agriculture and the link between industrial agriculture and pandemics. So the cost basically depends on the political system. So far, we've had about 2.5 million deaths from COVID, 110 million people been infected. About half of the deaths have been in the capitalist countries, and the cost to economies has been an extra $24 trillion added to global debts. Whereas in Cuba, which is socialist, which we'll be talking about later, we've had only about 280 deaths in total. So you can see the comparison. 35 in Vietnam, 0 in Cambodia, China, Venezuela, very low numbers of deaths. So COVID is basically a preventable illness, preventable disease, and the death cost depends on the political system. So just emphasizing the difference between this crisis and the previous global financial crisis. You can see the amount of money that they've pumped in has been a lot more and a lot steeper than the previous financial crisis in 2009. So trillions have basically been pumped in to prevent the collapse of the capitalist system. And of course, the working class will be made to pay through more austerity and wars. Okay, there are about 1.6 million known viruses, or 1.6 million viruses that exist, and about 700,000 of these can infect humans, mainly via animals and when they affect humans via animals, they're called zoonotic. 80% of this infection is via mammals, and a small number via birds. But out of this number, this 1.6 million, only 2 to 3,000 have been characterized. So we know very little about the viruses that are in the world. Of the 400, about 400 emerging infectious diseases since 1940, 60% are zoonotic, i.e., they come via animals. And some of these also infect livestock and pets, and 50% of the pathogens that infect livestock and pets are zoonotic as well. So they come from other animals into livestock and into pets, and from there onto humans. The imperialists, however, are focused on trying to prevent or preempt or predict where the next pandemic zoonosis is going to be. Everyone now accepts there's going to be another pandemic, but their predictions is focused on maybe the geographic source or which species in which places is going to be the next source. So you will see maps such as this, trying to pinpoint which areas they think the next emerging disease is going to come from. And it's mainly sort of Asia and parts of Central Africa, West Africa, Central Africa. And every year they kind of update the maps. And we'll come back to this map later. So there's something called newly emerging viruses. This is a little timeline. And basically, they're becoming more frequent. This doesn't include the current COVID. But yeah, you can see that they're becoming more frequent, and obviously bats are a common reservoir, but also birds and the influenza viruses. This is another map, another graphic, basically showing the same thing, that these new either new viruses or viruses that were previously existed re-emerging, but they're becoming more frequent. These viruses, these newly emerging viruses, are a serious threat to public health, and they cause a lot of deaths around the world. So the H1N1 influenza was a pandemic in 2009, and was a variant of previously existing influenza viruses. Cholera is an existing pandemic, an ignored pandemic, even though it was discovered in the last century, well, in the 19th century. There's still 4 million cases a year. The HIV is an ongoing pandemic as well. The imperialists haven't been able to find a cure for any of these pandemics. And then we're getting more and more newly emerging diseases. And then, of course, we've got the current pandemic. Right, so I'm going to just focus on a few of these examples, and hopefully through these examples, some themes will start to emerge. So take the Nipah virus. This is a new virus, highly virulent, and it's one of the world's deadliest, with a very high fatality rate. It first emerged in 1998 in Malaysia, in farmers in the pig industry. There was another outbreak in 1999, and it was caused by close contact with infected pigs. And that was the source of transmission. Then, following importation of these pigs from Malaysia, where there was an outbreak in Singapore among 11 abattoir workers. And then in 2001, there was another outbreaks, and there have been ongoing outbreaks in Bangladesh. A lot of it caused by consumption of raw fruits, which have been contaminated by bat droppings, for instance. Then there have been outbreaks in India. There's 3 outbreaks, and then there's an ongoing there was an outbreak last year in Kerala, which was better controlled. But these outbreaks had very high fatalities, Nosocomio means it was transmitted in hospitals. So the first person got it from an animal, and then the rest of them caught it from him in hospital. So basically, there was transmission of the virus from bats to pigs in Malaysia due to increase in overlap between bat habitats and piggeries in Malaysia. So piggeries were set up, and they're starting to encroach onto the habitats of bats. Why are bats so special? Well, they are natural reservoirs for a lot of viruses. They are unique because they are mammals that can fly, so they can travel long distances. And as mammals, they're closer relation to humans than to birds. They may have an immunity to a lot of these viruses. So they are interesting for that reason. And there are at least 3,000 coronaviruses that can infect bats, and there are 1,400 species of bats. So bats can infect an animal, and then you get transmission and mutation each time, and then it can spill over to humans. Each time it jumps, there's a mutation. The Ebola, the 6 strains of Ebola virus, the ones that affect Congo, the reservoirs are in fruit bats, but the Sudan Ebola virus strain and the Budingbuyo strains, they have unknown reservoirs. So the links to monkeys are speculative. Obviously, it's unknown because they're under-resourced diagnostics. But the new studies coming out now, which are suggesting that certainly in Uganda, domestic pigs are acting as amplifying hosts, if not reservoirs, for the Ebola virus. So it's linked to pig production, which has actually increased in Uganda in the recent decades. The majority of that is carried out by smallholder crop livestock farmers, but obviously as more investment goes in, that will intensify. We'll come back to that later. So yeah, this is a global map of pig production, and you can see Uganda is a bit of a hotspot for having a lot of pigs. That was in 2010, and you can see the big jump in the amount of pigs in Uganda. This is a map of pig populations in Uganda. So the darker, the more pigs per square kilometer. And these red arrows show where there have been Ebola outbreaks. And you can see that they are close to areas of large pig populations. But even the ones that are sort of farther away, it's been shown that these pigs can travel long distances. So there was some pigs that were tracked, and they covered 4.3 kilometers in a 12-hour period. I can hardly see this. Okay, hang on. Okay, that still says Ebola. Yeah. So livestock rearing and subsistence farming is interspersed with forests, which are actually suitable habitats for bats and primates. So you get increased contact between farmers and pigs, primates, and fruit bats. So there's been shown that there's a correlation between all previous Ebola virus outbreaks in Uganda and pig production. And so there's a potential zoonotic transmission of Ebola from pigs, basically. Okay, so what, just, bringing all this together, the Nipah virus, it's been reported, and it did emerge in these densely populated Southeast regions. Ebola in Africa is also densely populated. The population density leads to a high rate of interaction between individuals and the environments. You get coexistence of farm animals in these dense habitations, leads to a high risk of spillover. In many of these countries, pig farming is actually a major source of income. So you get deforestation, either for urbanization or for agriculture. which is actually leading to a loss of bat habitats. Bats are much maligned, but they're actually critical for seed dispersal and for pollination in these tropic forests. So the loss of their habitats forces them to remain in urban areas in close vicinity to human settlements. Okay, another example, the H1N1 influenza virus emerged in the US in 2009, so not all viruses come from China. It jumped from pigs to humans, it spread rapidly. That's the number of people that have died so far. It was the very first swine influenza virus that caused a pandemic. There's a difference between an outbreak, the outbreak, and the origins. So the outbreak is where the first case of something emerges, and in this case, it was actually in Mexico, where Smithfield Foods had a farm. 60% of the villagers became infected, but only one person was tested. But the origin was somewhere else. It was from the US, and 75% of the genes of the H1N1 actually came from another swine influenza that was discovered in North Carolina in 1998. And it was caused by intensive factory pig farming and was propelled and aided by long-distance live animal transport. So yeah, it was detected in North Carolina, and it was a triple, what's called a triple reassortant. I'll explain that later. And it spread from Carolina to Texas and Iowa, and it had never been seen before in the US. So this is basically what happened for the H1N1 in 2009. Is actually made up of it is itself a triple reassortant, so it has three parents, as it were. One of them came from the Eurasian H1N9 avian flu. Remember the Hong Kong outbreak in 1975? So that transferred onto European swine. And then in the 1990s, following imports of pigs into Mexico, the virus entered into Mexican swine. And that one contributed 2 genes. So each influenza virus has 8 genes, and 2 were contributed by this one, the Eurasian H1N1. One of them came from the original H1N1 from the Spanish flu. So just checking how much time I got. Which survived, again, was imported into Mexico in the 1990s following imports. That contributed one of the 8 genes. And then 5 of the genes, so the 75% I was saying, came from this Mexican swine, which was imported again in the 1990s. Itself is also a triple reassortant. It's got 3 dads. So the North American H1N1, human virus, the human flu that jumped into pigs, and avian flu. So it was also a triple reassortant, never been seen before, like I just said, in North Carolina. And then that was exported to Mexico, and then that all combined to form the H1N1 pandemic. Sorry about that, it's a bit complicated. So basically what happened, more than 2 million pigs were exported to the US, from the US to Mexico over that period. Majority of the exports were to Mexico, introduced swine viruses, not only from the US, but also from the UK, Ireland, Spain, Denmark, and Europe, were introduced into Mexico. So Mexico was a bit of an ecological sink, and this happened for at least 2 decades. Viruses that had never been seen before in Mexico, they were only previously seen in the US, Europe, and Asia, and they entered Mexico. So the international trade of live swine drove the long-distance migration of these viruses. So what was actually happening in the US and US farms? So North Carolina had the biggest pig population at the time and had the most so-called mega farms. So what was happening was in 1992, there were 2 million pigs in North Carolina, but by 1998, there were 10 million pigs. So you had more pigs. Similarly, in 1986, they had 15,000 farms, but by 2000, there were only 3,600 farms. So you had more pigs in smaller farms, in fewer farms. So you had the concentration of pigs. Also, in the 1980s, the majority of farms had less than 100 sows in each farm. A sow is a female pig. But by 1999, the majority of farms had over 1,000 sows. So you had a concentration of pigs, so they're close together. So as soon as a virus spreads to one, it can spread to most of them very quickly. We had the growth of the mega farms. That was a key development. It was owned by large corporations. It was worth a lot of money. Pigs were traveling from coast to coast, so they were being bred in North Carolina. They were being fattened in Iowa and then slaughtered in California. This was just to save overhead costs. So they were traveling coast to coast. So the viruses have more chance to mutate and then more chance to spread. Now, what's happening now is China is now a big producer of swine, of pork. So most of the exports, however, are by the imperialists. They do most of the exports and mostly exporting to China. But you can see now the capitalists are now jumping into the Chinese pig farming, and it's basically the names that we recognize. So it's Deutsche Bank, amazing, isn't it? Deutsche Bank investing in pig breeding, Lenovo, which is a Chinese company, Fosun, Mitsubishi, and these two are British companies you may probably never heard of. And yeah, in 2011, they shipped 800 breeding pigs to China. So the capitalists are getting involved in the Chinese market now. The Chinese pig population is jumped over the last 30 years compared to the US. The US is also increasing. It's hard to say when you blow it up. You see it's also increasing, but dwarfed by the Chinese pig industry. So they produce 50 million tons of meat every year. They have half the world's pig population. But again, most of them are still small-time breeders with fewer than 40 hogs per farm, I should say, sorry. But now they're moving towards building these mega farms like we saw in North Carolina, and multi-story pig farms with 1,000 sows per floor. So it's sort of moving to another level. But you're basically seeing the same intensification that we saw in North Carolina. So this is basically a disaster waiting to happen. There's basically going to be more pandemics emerging. WH Group, which is also called Shanghai, has then bought the biggest US food company, BlackRock, which I think the British are involved in that. What's that for? George Osborne is an advisor to BlackRock. They are major investors in WG Group now. There was an outbreak of African swine fever, which killed half of China's hog since 2018. This pushed up prices, and then now China is importing a lot of pork from Smithfield. So yeah, pork prices have risen. In spite of COVID outbreaks, they're basically just cashing in on meat exports to China, showing complete disregard for the safety of the workers during the pandemic. And of course, Smithfield, like we said earlier, was the source of the last pandemic in 2009. This is an important example, this African swine fever virus. It so far only affects pigs. Pig breeding was actually brought into Africa by the British. There was a first outbreak in 1907. Then it reached Portugal in 1957. So the colonialists took it to Portugal. It then spread throughout Europe. It was eradicated in the 1990s. The CIA imported it into Cuba in 1971 as a biological attack. It's re-emerged in Europe, and it's basically been spreading all over Europe, and it has now emerged in Asia as well. Then even there was an outbreak in Germany last year and in Romania this year. The thing about that is it's basically spread by humans. So normally in Africa, it was spread by ticks and insects, but in Europe, these ticks won't survive. So what has been seen is that infected meat, when the virus is detected, the meat is slaughtered and sent to market rather than destroying the pigs. The tracking how it spread along main roads and transport routes, which is a human, basically 100% human mark. In several countries, attempts to eradicate them resulted in these sounders, like a herd of pigs being chased across borders, spreading it into different countries. And then it's been discovered even in the Baltic states, where wild boar can't survive. So they're being artificially kept to be fed, to be hunted. So they're being fed for hunting purposes, and that spreads this virus into the Baltic states. So these are the maps that we're being shown these days where infectious diseases are most likely to emerge. So, Latin America, Central Africa, China. But this is what the map should look like. The blame lies with the capitalists. We should be looking at where's the capital coming from, from the US into Mexico, from Europe into Central Africa, from Europe into Asia, from Hong Kong into Malaysia and all these places. That's where the blame should be lying. So these pandemics, in summary, are caused by increased contact between humans and animals, which leads to an increased likelihood of spillover, where viruses jump from species to species and jump into humans. It's caused by deforestation and changes in the use of land, encroachment onto wild habitats, urbanization. Again, urbanization is also driven by capitalism because workers are forced to go into the urban areas to look for work. So they have to leave the rural areas and go into the urban areas in order to look for work, because that's where the factories are, that's where the jobs are. I mean, even in Britain, we're seeing that now. People migrating to the big cities, to look for work. But even urbanization is driven by capitalism. Intensive farming, agribusiness, and then once the virus emerges, you've got global trade and travel, which can spread it worldwide. Climate change is another factor. So, for instance, we're now seeing, because of global warming, we're now seeing viruses emerging in the northern hemisphere, which didn't emerge there before, like the West Nile virus, which is carried by mosquitoes. So the mosquitoes are now more comfortable in the northern hemisphere, and so they can new viruses are re-emerging in the northern hemisphere thanks to climate change. And the main driver of all of this is the pursuit of profit, basically capitalism in its imperialist phase. There is a danger that people might think, well, the problem of all this is eating meat. And if we stop eating meat, if we stop eating pork, then there will be no problem. But that's the wrong way of looking at it, because global food production, including production of fruits and vegetables, is also controlled by the capitalists. There's an example in the latest issue of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism of banana production and how different species of banana are being eradicated due to the use of pesticides and mass production. So it's a good article, actually. I would encourage people to read it. So it's not just about eating meat, it's about the capitalist system itself. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. That was so packed with information. It was really, really useful. We've got some questions already in the chat. One of these questions, I think it will be better